Julian Coleman never expected his first night as chief of police to end in handcuffs. He had just left his office after a late meeting, driving his modest car through the quiet streets of the city he'd sworn to protect. No uniform, no flashing badge, just a black man behind the wheel. The red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror without warning. Two officers approached, tense and aggressive. They never asked for ID. They never explained why. They simply ordered him out of the car, slammed him against it, and cuffed him like a criminal. He tried to speak, calmly, respectfully, telling them they were making a mistake. But his words were met with rolled eyes and smirks. One officer, the younger of the two, called him boy. The other searched his vehicle without cause. And through it all, Julian stayed silent, not because he was afraid, but because he was calculating. He knew the law. He knew the statistics. And he knew what could happen if he resisted. When they shoved him into the back of the squad car, he stared out the window, not with rage, but with quiet heartbreak. This was his department. These were his men. At the precinct, the truth unfolded like a slow, uncomfortable wave. The watch commander's face drained of color when Julian calmly asked for the phone. "Get the mayor," he said. "Tell him the new chief has arrived, just not the way he should have." The silence in the room was deafening. The officers who had arrested him stood frozen, their eyes wide with realization. One tried to explain, stammering something about protocol and lighting. Julian didn't flinch. "You didn't see a man," he said. "You saw a threat." Word spread fast. The mayor arrived, red-faced and stumbling over apologies. Internal Affairs launched an investigation. And Julian, despite pressure to quietly let it go, chose a different path. At the next department meeting, he stood before his entire force, stoic, composed, yet visibly hurt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call for revenge. He called for reckoning. He spoke of broken trust, of biases buried under badges, and of a culture that punishes difference more than dishonor. "I will not lead a department that sees its chief as a suspect before a citizen," he said. "We're not just enforcers of the law, we are symbols of it. And if we can't see our own people with dignity, then we have no business wearing this uniform." That speech, quiet, firm, raw, reverberated far beyond those walls. Officers resigned. Others stepped forward, admitting past wrongs and asking how to change. Julian didn't demand perfection. He demanded honesty. He implemented mandatory racial bias training, body cam accountability, and a community review board with real power, not just a seat at the table, but a voice that mattered. Julian Coleman didn't just survive that night, he transformed it into a turning point. Not just for himself, but for every officer who thought the badge made them invincible, and for every citizen who thought justice was a myth. He didn't let the moment define him. He defined it. And in doing so, he reminded a city that true leadership isn't about authority. It's about responsibility. From that day forward, the precinct felt different. Not immediately, change never arrives overnight, but gradually, undeniably. Officers began spending time in the neighborhoods they once patrolled with detachment. They sat with local business owners, walked with community leaders, and listened, truly listened, to the people they were sworn to serve. It wasn't about optics or quotas. It was about rebuilding what had been quietly broken for decades, trust. Julian didn't seek praise. He stayed late most nights, reviewing case files, quietly attending community forums, personally meeting with families who had lost loved ones to injustice, sometimes at the hands of his own department. He didn't have all the answers, but he never shied away from the questions. He was present. Accountable. Human. And in his humanity, others began to find theirs. The two officers who arrested him faced disciplinary action. One resigned. The other, surprisingly, asked for a chance to learn. Julian met with him privately. No press. No cameras. Just two men on opposite sides of a mistake that could have ended so much worse. They talked for hours, not just about that night, but about everything that led to it. The officer admitted his assumptions, his fears, his upbringing. Julian didn't offer easy forgiveness. But he offered a path, because transformation, he believed, begins with confrontation, not cancellation. Soon, the city began to see the ripple effects. Complaints against officers dropped. Recruitment efforts focused on emotional intelligence, cultural awareness, and lived experience, not just physical strength or tactical prowess. Julian launched a youth mentorship program, pairing officers with at-risk teens, not to monitor them, but to mentor them. "We can't police away pain," he said at the program's launch. "But we can meet it with presence, with patience, with purpose." Local media picked up the story. Headlines shifted from outrage to inspiration. Chief Coleman turns trauma into reform. The arrest that changed a city. But Julian rarely gave interviews. He believed real stories weren't told on the news. They were lived, every day, in the spaces between right and wrong, fear and hope. A year later, on the anniversary of his wrongful arrest, Julian stood again before his department, this time with officers who had grown, changed, and reflected. "You didn't just get a new chief," he told them. "You got a new mirror. And what you choose to see in it, that's your responsibility." That night, a mural was unveiled across from the precinct. Julian's face, not in a uniform, but in a hoodie, standing tall, hands uncuffed, eyes steady. Beneath it were the words, "Justice sees the whole man." For Julian Coleman, leadership was never about titles. It was about testimony. And his was one written not in reports or press releases, but in the quiet, uncomfortable moments where truth demands to be seen, even in handcuffs. And as the mural caught the glow of the setting sun, something remarkable happened. Families who once avoided the precinct now gathered around it, taking photos, pointing out the painting to their children, not as a symbol of fear, but of transformation. A grandmother stood silently before the mural, tears welling in her eyes. "My grandson used to ask me why the police hated us," she whispered to no one in particular. "Now he asks how he can become one and do it right." Julian, standing in the background, heard her words. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. This was the impact he had hoped for. Not fanfare or applause, but a shift in possibility. A change in the questions being asked by the next generation. In time, Julian's story spread beyond city borders. Other departments reached out. Town halls were held in places that had long silenced voices like his. Training manuals were rewritten. Policies were reviewed. And somewhere, quietly but powerfully, systems began to bend, not because they wanted to, but because someone finally stood still long enough in their truth to force them to. Julian knew the work was far from done. Racism didn't vanish with a single arrest. Bias wasn't cured by a public apology. But now, there was momentum. A movement built not on hashtags or headlines, but on hard conversations, honest leadership, and the undeniable power of lived experience. And perhaps the most poetic part of it all. The very officers who once handcuffed Julian would later stand beside him, unarmed, unguarded. As he unveiled a citywide initiative for racial equity and accountability. It was raw. It was uncomfortable. But it was real. Julian ended the event with a simple, steady voice: "We cannot lead people we refuse to understand. We cannot protect people we are afraid to truly see. And we cannot ask for trust if we aren't willing to first earn it, day by day, moment by moment, mistake by mistake." As the crowd applauded, a young boy, no older than 10, raised his hand and asked, "Chief Coleman, do you think I could do what you do someday?" Julian knelt down, looked the boy in the eyes, and smiled. "I hope you never have to. But if you do, do it better." And in that moment, beneath the shadow of a mural and the weight of history, something unshakable was planted, not just hope, but a future rewritten by the courage to stand still, and be seen. Years passed. The precinct, once marred by distrust, became a national case study in reform. Other departments modeled their internal culture after Julian's initiatives: real-time de-escalation feedback, community-led oversight panels, and implicit bias recalibration sessions that went far beyond standard diversity training. But even as recognition poured in, Julian remained grounded. Every accolade reminded him of the night he sat in that holding cell, faceless in the eyes of a system he now helped rebuild. One rainy afternoon, Julian visited a local high school for a mentorship program he helped launch. As he stood before a room of young, skeptical students, many of whom had their own reasons to mistrust the badge, he didn't open with statistics or slogans. Instead, he told them the truth. "I was once arrested for fitting a description," he said quietly. "And I run the department that arrested me." The room went still. Eyes widened. Not out of disbelief, but recognition. Julian wasn't selling them a fantasy. He was showing them what survival could become when transformed into service. After the session, a quiet teen approached him. "Did it ever get easier?" he asked. Julian paused, then answered with a soft certainty. "No. But I got stronger. And eventually, so did the system around me." Back at his office that evening, Julian sat alone. The sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across his desk, shadows that once felt like chains, now resembling the outlines of bridges being built. On the wall behind him hung the framed photo of his late father, a man who never lived to see his son wear the badge with pride. Julian often spoke to that photo, especially on days like this. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "And I'm not done." The camera of the world never stopped rolling. But now, Julian was directing the narrative. Not just as a black man, not just as a police chief, but as a leader who refused to let injustice have the final word. He knew that change was slow, sometimes painfully so. But with each policy shift, each human moment of connection, and each seed of trust carefully replanted, a new kind of justice was emerging, one born not of fear or force, but of vision, compassion, and truth. And Julian Coleman, once wrongly cuffed under the weight of ignorance, now walked freely through halls of power, carrying not vengeance, but responsibility. Because the real revolution, he believed, wasn't loud. It was consistent. Months turned into years, and the culture Julian helped cultivate didn't just shift, it evolved. Officers who once scoffed at change began mentoring new recruits with empathy and purpose. Former critics in the community started volunteering on advisory boards. Schools invited officers to career days not with fear, but with curiosity. The precinct, once a fortress of tension, had become a bridge of dialogue. Still, Julian knew better than to grow comfortable. Progress, he had learned, was not a straight line. Every victory could be unraveled if the roots weren't tended to. So he remained vigilant. Not in suspicion, but in service. One evening, after attending a memorial for a community elder who had been a vocal critic of the police, yet later became a dear ally, Julian stood before a small crowd. Candlelight flickered against tear-streaked faces. "She once called us the problem," Julian said, his voice low and reverent. "But over time, she became part of the solution. Because when people feel heard, they stop shouting." The silence that followed was thick with truth. In the days that followed, Julian made it a personal mission to reach those still on the margins, those who didn't believe change was possible. He met with formerly incarcerated citizens, with grieving mothers, with protesters still holding signs, and he didn't arrive as a chief. He arrived as a man who once had cuffs on his own wrists for a crime he never committed. The story of that night, of his wrongful arrest, never left the city's consciousness. It remained both a scar and a beacon. Not a wound to hide, but a lesson to teach. He even had it included in new cadet training, not as a cautionary tale against getting caught, but as a foundational lesson in humility, perception, and power. One young officer in training once asked him, "Sir, do you ever regret staying in this system?" Julian looked him in the eye. Every day I stay, I fight for the people who are told they don't belong here. I don't regret that. I live for it. Eventually, his efforts drew national attention. Networks called. Magazines profiled him. Even DC came knocking with advisory roles and offers of higher office. But Julian always returned to the same answer: this city, these streets, they're where my story started. And where it's still being written. And so, the story of Julian Coleman. The wrongly accused turned reformer, the chief who chose justice over ego, the man who never stopped being a son, a mentor, and a listener, continued. Not in grand speeches or sweeping laws alone, but in quiet changes, a respectful nod exchanged between a teenager and a beat cop. A reduced complaint on a street that once boiled with unrest. A department where policy wasn't written in fear, but in hope. Julian often said, "The badge doesn't make you honorable. Your choices do." And through every choice, he proved it.